In the quiet, suburban enclave of Park Hill, Calgary, the morning of June 30th, 2014, began with a silence so profound it felt heavy. Park Hill was the kind of neighborhood people moved to for peace, a sanctuary of tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and a neighborly spirit that seemed to insulate it from the harshness of the outside world. This was the sanctuary of Alvin and Kathy Lickneys. Alvin, 66, was a respected professional on the verge of a well-earned retirement, and Kathy, 53, was the family's emotional anchor, a woman whose nurturing spirit made her the ultimate confidant for her daughter, Jennifer. The couple was standing on the threshold of a new chapter. They had sold their home and were packing to move to Edmonton, with plans to spend their winters under the Mexican sun in Mazatlan. The weekend had been busy with an estate sale, a final clearing out of decades of memories. Their daughter Jennifer had been there with her sons, including 5-year-old Nathan. Nathan was a boy who seemed to vibrate with life, a cherubic child with sun-kissed hair and a perpetual obsession with superheroes. He saw the world as a place of adventure, and on that Sunday night, he begged his mother for one last sleepover at his grandparents' house. Jennifer, seeing his excitement, agreed. She took her youngest son home, leaving Nathan in what she believed were the safest hands in the world. When Jennifer returned the next morning, the silence of Park Hill was no longer peaceful, it was terrifying. The front door of her parents' home stood wide open. Stepping inside, the warmth of the family home had been replaced by a chilling, metallic scent that permeated the air. Puddles of blood stained the floors. On the walls, broad, crimson smears told a story of a violent struggle, suggesting that bodies had been dragged through the house. But the detail that shattered Jennifer's soul was a tiny, bloody handprint located low on the wall, the height of a 5-year-old boy. It looked as though Nathan had reached out to steady himself in the darkness of a nightmare. Her parents and her son were gone. The ensuing investigation was a massive undertaking that gripped the entire nation. An Amber Alert was issued, and the city of Calgary became a landscape of search parties and police tape. Forensic teams discovered that a side door lock had been meticulously drilled out, indicating that this was not a random act of passion, but a planned, cold-blooded intrusion. Yet, despite the carnage, the perpetrator had left almost no trace, no foreign fingerprints, no stray DNA. For weeks, the police and the public held onto a sliver of hope that the trio was being held captive somewhere, perhaps injured but alive. Jennifer and her husband Rod even took to the television screens, addressing Nathan directly, telling him to be a superhero and stay strong. Investigators spent thousands of hours analyzing CCTV footage from across the city. They eventually spotted a late 1980s Ford F-150 pickup truck circling the Park Hill area in the pre-dawn hours of the disappearance. Later footage showed the same truck heading north toward the town of Airdrie, carrying a large object in the bed covered with a white tarp. When the image of the truck was released to the media, a woman named Patty Garland recognized it instantly. It belonged to her brother, 56-year-old Douglas Garland. Douglas Garland was a man of high intelligence but deep, festering resentments. A former medical student who had been expelled for cheating, he had a history of mental instability and a criminal record involving identity theft and drug manufacturing. He lived on a sprawling 16-hectare farm with his elderly parents, a recluse who nursed a 7-year-old grudge against Alvin Lickneys over a failed business patent for an oilfield pump. To Alvin, the dispute was a minor professional disagreement from years past. To Garland, it was a life-altering insult that demanded a horrific price. In a hidden crawlspace and buried in the basement, they discovered a kill kit that suggested years of meticulous planning. They found meat hooks, bone saws, surgical scalpels, and professional-grade handcuffs, including a pair small enough for a child's wrists. They also found a digital archive of depravity, thousands of documents on how to perform torture, how to kill without emotion, and how to dispose of human remains to avoid detection. The breakthrough that finally sealed Garland's fate came from the heavens. By a near-impossible coincidence, a private aerial photography plane had been flying over the Airdrie area on July 1st, just a day after the kidnapping, mapping the city for a municipal project. When detectives zoomed into the high-resolution images of the Garland property, they saw 3 shapes lying in the grass near the farm's outbuildings. 2 were large, and 1 was much smaller. They were lying face down. It was a visual confirmation of the unthinkable. Spent weeks sifting through the ashes of a large industrial burn barrel on the property. In those ashes, they found the final, devastating proof: tiny fragments of bone, a single baby tooth belonging to Nathan, and the charred metal frames of Alvin's glasses. Garland had not only taken their lives, he had attempted to erase their very existence. In 2017, Douglas Garland stood trial. He was an impassive figure in the courtroom, showing no remorse as the graphic details of his science project were laid bare for the jury. The prosecution argued that Garland's intelligence had been used to weaponize his bitterness, leading him to execute a plan that was as sophisticated as it was soulless. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, reflecting the horror felt by all of Canada, sentenced Garland to the harshest penalty possible: life in prison with no chance of parole for 75 years. At his age, it was a guarantee that he would die in a cell. The story of the Ligneys and O'Brien families is a tragedy that left an indelible mark on the world, but it is also a story of resilience. Jennifer and Rod O'Brien chose not to let the narrative end with Garland's darkness. They established the Nathan O'Brien Children's Foundation, a charity that provides sports equipment and opportunities for disadvantaged children. Nathan's last conversation with his father had been about what heaven was like. He told his dad he would meet him there one day, soaring through the clouds. While the void left by Alvin, Kathy, and little Nathan can never be filled, their legacy is one of light. This story serves as a poignant, painful reminder to cherish the people we love. For we live in a world where the line between a peaceful suburban night and a nightmare can be as thin as a shadow. Nathan had stayed the night with his grandparents, Alvin and Kathy Ligneys, after a weekend estate sale. As Jennifer stepped out of her car, the tranquility of the tree-lined street felt wrong. The front door was slightly ajar. Inside, the domestic sanctuary she had known her whole life had been transformed into a house of horrors. The air was thick with the metallic, iron-like scent of fresh blood. Puddles of crimson stained the hardwood floors, and long, jagged smears ran along the walls of the hallway, indicating that bodies had been moved with brutal force. But the detail that would forever be seared into the national consciousness of Canada was a tiny, bloody handprint low on the wall, the height of a 5-year-old boy. It was a silent testament to a child's final, desperate attempt to steady himself in a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. Nathan, Alvin, and Kathy were gone. The subsequent investigation would eventually peel back the layers of a history so petty and so poisoned that it seemed impossible it could lead to such carnage. The link was a man named Douglas Garland. The connection to the Ligneys family was through Garland's own sister, Patty, who was the common-law wife of one of Alvin and Kathy's sons. But the real rot had begun nearly a decade earlier, in 2006. Alvin Ligneys, a successful businessman and inventor, had been working on a prototype for an oil-field pump. Douglas Garland, a man of high intelligence but fractured social skills and a history of mental instability, was brought in to help refine the design. Alvin. It was a simple business venture that ultimately failed to produce a profit and was eventually shelved. To Douglas, however, it was the start of a 7-year descent into a delusional obsession. He convinced himself that Alvin had stolen his intellectual property and cheated him out of a fortune, despite the fact that the pump never generated a single cent. This was a grievance built on nothing but a phantom insult that Douglas nurtured in the isolation of his parents' farm until it became a homicidal mission. In June 2014, Douglas saw his window of opportunity closing. They were downsizing, they were leaving his reach. He decided to act with the precision of a hunter. Early on the morning of June 30th, while the neighborhood of Park Hill slept, Douglas used technical knowledge found on his computer to drill out the lock of the side door. Forensic reconstruction suggests a sequence of events that is almost too painful to visualize. Douglas entered the master bedroom first, where Alvin was sleeping, striking him multiple times with a blunt, heavy weapon. He then moved to the guest room where Kathy and Nathan were asleep. The sheer volume of blood found in the house led experts to believe that all 3 were still alive, but severely injured, when Douglas dragged them out of their beds and into the back of his Ford F-150. He covered them with a white tarp, a chilling detail later spotted on neighborhood surveillance cameras as the truck sped north toward his parents' 16-hectare farm in Airdrie. What happened on that farm was a systematic execution of a long-held fantasy. When the emergency response team eventually searched the property, they found the DNA of all 3 victims on an array of horrific tools: meat hooks, bone saws, and knives. A bloodied light switch inside one of the outbuildings bore the genetic profiles of both Alvin and Kathy, suggesting they had been held there in their final moments. Perhaps the most haunting discovery was a hidden hard drive tucked away in the basement rafters. It was filled with deleted photos Garland had taken of the couple over the years, proving he had been stalking them, watching them, and waiting for the right moment to strike. It also contained a digital library of human destruction, with manuals on how to kill without emotion and instructions on the most painful methods of torture. The trial, which began in early 2017, became a moment of profound national mourning. The defense argued that the evidence was purely circumstantial, pointing out that no one had actually seen Douglas inside the Park Hill home. But the prosecution produced a piece of evidence that can only be described as a miracle from the heavens. On July 1, 2014, the very day after the kidnapping, a private aerial photography plane had been mapping the Airdrie area for a city project. By a one-in-a-million coincidence, the high-resolution camera captured 2 frames of the Garland farm. When investigators zoomed in on those photos, the horrific reality was laid bare. 3 torsos were lying face down in the grass near a series of outbuildings. 2 were large, adult figures, and 1 was much smaller, the unmistakable size of a 5-year-old boy. The adults were naked, except for white fabric wrapped around their waists, consistent with a disturbing fetish for adult diapers discovered in Garland's basement. By the time the pilot flew over the farm again 26 hours later, the figures were gone. The only things left for the forensic teams were the ashes in a large industrial burn barrel. For weeks, officers worked on their hands and knees, sifting through the remains. Inside that barrel, they found the final, heartbreaking remnants of 3 lives, fragments of charred bone, bits of flesh, and a single baby tooth that belonged to Nathan. The silence of the deceased had become a roar of evidence. Rod O'Brien, Nathan's father, wrote a statement that echoed through the silent courtroom, expressing the agonizing truth that they weren't even given the chance to bury their boy, as there was virtually nothing left of him to lay to rest. After 10 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge showed no mercy, sentencing Douglas Garland to 3 consecutive life terms. At 56 years old, the 75-year no-parole period meant he would have to live to be 129 years old to ever see the outside of a prison wall. Justice was served, but it was a cold comfort for a family that had been decimated by a 7-year-old grudge. Jennifer and Rod O'Brien made a conscious, heroic choice to ensure their son's name would stand for something more than a tragedy. They established the Nathan O'Brien Children's Foundation, a beacon of hope that has since transformed the lives of countless disadvantaged children. They chose to celebrate Nathan's love for superheroes by funding sports programs, hockey camps, and opportunities for children to thrive. Nathan, who spent his life imagining he could soar through the clouds in a cape, is now remembered through the joy of other children. Nathan's last conversation with his father remains a hauntingly beautiful memory. He had asked Rod what heaven was like, and told his dad he would meet him there one day, flying high above the world. Rod even thought that his son somehow sensed that his time was short. Today, Nathan's mother, Jennifer, watches with tears in her eyes as Nathan's friends grow into young men, knowing she will never see her own boy reach adulthood. The Lickneys and O'Brien case remains a tragic chapter in Calgary's history, an indelible mark on the hearts of an entire country. It serves as a poignant, painful reminder to cherish our loved ones, for we live in a world where the line between a peaceful suburban night and a nightmare can be as thin as the edge of a blade. But more than that, it is a story of how a little superhero and his grandparents inspired a community to choose kindness over cruelty and hope over despair. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share if you want more true crime. See you in the next case.